Welcome to the Toronto launch event for Cybernetic Circulation Complex, Big Tech in Planetary Crisis. We're honored tonight to be hosting the authors Alessandra Mularoni and Dyer-Witheford. This event has been organized by the Leo Panitch School for Socialist Education with support from the Digital Labor Working Group at the University of Toronto. First, we would like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Anishbab, Howden, Soni, Chippewa, and Mississauga of the Credit. Further, we acknowledge the right of First Nation people to true national self-determination. We also believe that it's important to recognize the common struggles experienced by both indigenous and non-indigenous working people, as well as the ways in which capitalism relies on prejudice, exploitation, and oppression to keep us divided. We also want to acknowledge the ongoing genocide in Palestine by the Israeli state, and still to this day supported by the Canadian government. We join calls for a two-way arms embargo and encourage attendees to heed calls for action from Palestinian trade unions and civil society groups. Now, my name is Rafael Grohmann. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto and co-organizer of the Digital Labor Working Group. There we are supporting this event, and now we'll have the book talk on Cybernetic Circulation Complex. When I read Nick's work for the first time, I was a young PhD student in Brazil more than 10 years ago. I was younger. And two of the notions for me were so important were cycles and circulation, and how circulation was so important for my own research. I'm so happy that this book focused on this notion of circulation, especially circulation of commodities, circulation of antagonism, the circulation of the environment. So let's talk about Cybernetic Circulation Complex, Big Tech and Planetary Crisis with Alessandra Mularoni and Dyer-Witheford.
Let's do a start. Unless you don't want it. You don't need it? Okay.
So thank you very much, Rafael. Thank you, Matt. Thank you to the Leo Panitch School and the Socialist Project and the Bubble. Thank you, all of you who have turned out despite the vicious weather. I think it's fair to say that Alessandra and I are both warmed by this expression of interest in our work. We wrote Cybernetic Circulation Complex out of the experience of teaching for years students about big tech, the digital capitalists who they and all of us encounter daily in our on-screen lives. So tonight, I'm going to start by giving a quick, I hope, overview of the book's argument with the assistance of some slides prepared by our friend and comrade Giles Whitaker. I'm going to be going through those slides fairly rapidly, but I wanted to let you know that if you want to take a longer look at them, they're all available for free under a Creative Commons license on our website, and you have only to get in touch with us in order to download those. After I've given this overview, Alessandra will take the second half of the presentation to explain in some depth an important part of our book, which is the proposal of what we term a biocommunist alternative to big tech. So I think that it's important to emphasize that in studying big tech, we are not simply looking at individual firms. We are rather studying a sectoral system of contemporary capitalism, a system which we can visualize as a pyramid with, at the top, the big tech giants, the initial big five of Alphabet, previously Google, Amazon, Apple, Meta, previously Facebook, and Microsoft. Now, more recently, often conventionally joined by NVIDIA and Tesla to make up the so-called Magnificent Seven. Below them, a set of mid-tier and emerging firms, some of whose names will be familiar to you: Uber, Salesforce, Palantir, others more obscure perhaps, but not necessarily any the less powerful. And at the base, thousands of venture-funded startups, including the not-so-fabulous unicorn startups valued at over $1 billion. Now, this sector has overlaps and affinities with other parts of the capitalist economy, perhaps most notably the financial sector and the military-industrial complex. But we want to argue that it also has its own distinct role and contributory function. I'll just add that these pyramidal shapes remind you of the corporate headquarters in the film Blade Runner. That's not altogether accidental. Now, if big tech is our object of study, then what is our theoretical matrix, our lens through which we examine it? It is the concept of circulation, and in particular, the circuit of capital as presented by Marx, where he describes capital as a process of value in motion, in which money is used to purchase commodities, which are then sold for more money, part of which is then used to produce yet further commodities, so on, ad infinitum, rinse and repeat. As many of you here will know well, for Marx, production in the factory creates value through labor exploitation, but circulation in the market is where that value is realized in exchange. In Marx's model, production is primary and circulation is secondary. But though it is secondary, it is also essential. As Marx repeatedly underlines, no sales, no value realized. Speeding circulation cuts the turnover time of capital, allowing the production to be, with a given amount of capital to be repeated more often, and expanding markets also allows for the expanding of production. So, in fact, faster, wider circulation equals higher profits, even though no new surplus value is necessarily produced. We extend and add to Marx's classic model of the circuit of capital in a couple of ways. We add a subsphere for social reproduction to acknowledge the unpaid and, of course, often gendered labor that is expended in caring, cooking, education, rest, and recreation in order to ensure that labor power is available every day to return to work. And we also put a special emphasis on the financial sector, whose genesis Marx did indeed comment on, but which today has exploded into a massive apparatus of credit, derivatives, and other speculative instruments, through which capital attempts now to leap directly from money to money prime, money to more money, without going through the messy and conflict-filled site of production. I think you now perhaps get a glimpse of why we term our book the Cybernetic Circulation Complex, because our primary argument is that the US tech sector is in fact best understood as a circulatory machine. What is conventionally termed as big tech is in fact a complex whose profits come less from producing commodities and more from automating, combining and accelerating various modes of circulation. Advertising, retail, logistics, payments, and market coordination are all amongst the primary concerns of the cybernetic circulation complex. So, for example, Google and Meta are not, in fact, content producers. They sell attention to advertisers. Amazon organizes consumption and delivery logistics. And even where the firms of the cybernetic circulation complex do, in fact, produce artifacts, such as smartphones or data centers, these are surveillance tools, shopping devices, data capture machines for targeted ads, and command and prediction centers for the coordination of market activities. So that, in fact, circulation becomes production, or to put it another way, we can say that what the cybernetic circulation complex produces is, in fact, circulation. Just as railways and steamships in Marx's times were means of communication and transportation, which themselves became a form of industrial base, so we see big tech producing circulation as an essential infrastructure for contemporary production. And we would add to this also the important point that the commodities which are sold through the cybernetic circulation complex are not simply goods and artifacts and services, which are indicated over at this side of the diagram, but also the all-important commodity labor power, the buying and selling of labor power itself has been transformed by these companies through the app-based gig work, which atomizes, fragments, and monetizes on a moment-by-moment basis, pioneered by Amazon Mechanical Turk, magnified and applied to the transportation sector by Uber, and now ubiquitously realized across a vast range of labor activities. Also, especially important to our analysis is the close interweaving of finance, venture capital, and AI in the cybernetic circulation complex. This overlap between technology and finance is one of the crucial dimensions of the circulatory activities, particularly in the money-to-money prime part of the circuit. We must remember that there is a powerful case to be made that Silicon Valley itself invented venture capital. And today's big tech firms not only themselves grew out of venture capital funding, but now big tech is itself venture capital, especially in the funding of AI startups, in which it is playing a leading role. All of the firms whose names are provided to you here and that you see in the diagram are deeply, deeply entangled with stock markets, pension funds, and global finance. Apple even runs its own hedge fund like operation. So now I hope that you can see why we call what is colloquially named big tech, why we have renamed it as the cybernetic circulation complex, affectionately CCC, sales of commodities, sales of labor power, sales of money, financial dealing. There are a couple of points which I want to emphasize in this. One, actually, I'm going to go back again just to. One is that in order to get to consumers, gig workers, and borrowers with its digital automated instruments, big tech has to traverse, disrupt, and transform social reproduction, altering patterns of sociality, expectations of privacy, circadian rhythms of sleep, modalities of individuality, habits of sexuality, constructions of youth and households. It is a life-transforming force. Moreover, these dynamics play out within the world market. Big tech's main revenues continue to come from the affluent sections of the world market in North America and Europe, but it sells its services, gathers data globally, and draws in resources and labor from around the planet, where its only real rival is China's digital sector, which a situation which has created an epicenter of geopolitical conflict, which I'll return in a moment. Having established this centrality of the cybernetic circulation complex to the circulation of commodities, Alessandra and I then go on to establish some of the collateral social and ecological effects, which we treat as distinct forms of circulation. For example, the circulation of social antagonisms. That is to say, the way that digital platforms now mediate social conflicts. Now, those of you who are perhaps as old as I am, or only a little younger, will remember that early in the appearance of the internet, many of us, certainly myself included, believed that digitally mediated politics, colloquially cyber activism, empowered the left. And this was indeed, to some degree, the case with the globalization movement of the late 1990s and early 2000s, and appeared to be reappearing in the dynamics of the Arab Spring and Occupy in the early 2010s. However, since 2016, this momentum has shifted sharply to the right. Today, we see that digital platforms often amplify reaction, conspiracy theories, and forms of proto-fascism. Now, there is a very common explanation that is offered even by the Silicon Valley elite for these processes. They argue, or they'll confess, that engagement algorithms reward outrage, that for digital companies whose revenues are based on advertising, hosting inflammatory content is in fact a sure way to tap into expanded revenues, so that polarization and extremism becomes a tool of profit. Alessandra and I agree that this is partly true, but we also think that it is an incomplete analysis, because the deeper causes of the emergence of intensifying class conflict and sharper polarizations between left and right are material. They are issues not just of algorithms, but of deindustrialization, stagnant wages, insecure gig labor, and extreme inequality. And we see these material conditions as dynamics to which the cybernetic circulation complex has itself directly contributed. Firms of big tech have indeed participated in the offshoring of production, such as electronic assembly work and chip production from North America to Asia. They've contributed to the casualization of labor through the gig economy, as I've described. They are indeed emblematic of the sort of extreme concentrations of wealth, of which figures like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and today Elon Musk are paragon examples. And they have also, a point to which we devote special attention, played a special role in creating whole new sectors of nominally self-employed agents, whether these may be gig workers who are led to believe by their employers that they are in fact independent contractors, or internet influencers, or drop shippers, or so on. Sectors who very often are characterized and may characterize themselves as independent entrepreneurs, even though the reality of their condition is thoroughly proletarianized. A new digital petty bourgeoisie recreating the very social strata which classical Marxist analysis has seen as favorable to the rise of fascist movements. So our point here is that the cybernetic circulation complex, far from being simply in play in terms of various forms of virtual manipulation, is also playing a significant role in changing the composition of capital and changing its class composition in ways which are by no means necessarily advantageous to the left. Additionally, we also name a third form of circulation, ecological circulations. We argue that the cybernetic circulation complex accelerates not just markets, not just data, but planetary flows of carbon, energy, and water. Firms in this sector very often present themselves as green, ethical capitalists and as providing instruments for eco-crisis management. But their core mission is in fact to speed up global capitalism, to speed and expand the movement of the circuit of capital. And this in fact directly undermines their pretensions to be guardians of ecological stability. This is radically in view around the issue of artificial intelligence. I think all of you will have heard of the issues surrounding energy and water consumption by the vast data centers which are required for AI development. And in fact, companies such as Google and Microsoft have increasingly abandoned their nominal net zero pledges, which often, in any case, relied on dubious carbon offset projects, but have quite specifically put these commitments into abeyance, claiming the necessity of increased energy usage to produce AI. However, we also underline that there is another even greater ecological hazard associated with the cybernetic circulation complex. And this ecological danger is simultaneously a geopolitical flashpoint. It is dangers of war emerging in their most extreme form around US-China rivalry, already in place in terms of competition over semiconductors and digital sovereignty. In this situation, we have seen big tech increasingly aligned with military systems, with what Jairus Grove calls the savage ecology of war, with cloud computing facilities made available for military purposes, and the fabrication of AI command and control systems and battlefield surveillance by newcomers to the sector, such as Musk's Starlink, Palantir, and Anduril. The fruits of this are seen today in the drone-filled skies over Ukraine, in the cybernetic hellscape of Gaza. In short, cybernetic circulation complex is in fact increasingly becoming unified with the military industrial complex, with on the dread horizon the possibilities of thermonuclear cyber war between China and the US. So the evident question is, where do we go from here? We have argued that the cybernetic circulation complex drives runaway commodification on a damaged planet. We believe that antitrust legislation is by no means enough, that digital withdrawal by individuals, although often tempting, is unrealistic, that plans for or schemes for crypto-socialism based on cryptocurrencies probably worsen the problem. Our proposal is instead digitized biocommunism, the struggle for a social system based on the dual priorities of ecological sustainability and social equality. At this point, I'm going to hand you over to Alessandra to develop this part of our analysis.
Thank you. Nick and I were thinking about how to represent some of the ideas in the book in a fresh way, so I do have a participatory element planned, but before we get to that, I'll start with an explanation or an overview of what we mean by this idea of biocommunism. So the section on biocommunism is my favorite part of the book, precisely because it is as much of an action plan or a prospectus as it is a theoretical framework for reimagining our technological systems and even how they might function in a way to combat the sort of accelerationist neoliberal paradigm of circulation. And we believe that this is possible because there are historical antecedents demonstrating the real-world impact of cybernetic systems and democratic organization. To plug some other books, James Muldoon's platform Socialism and Drew Pendergrass and Troy Vitesse's Half-Earth Socialism both examine the potential for socialist cybernetics. And we were really inspired by their work, as well as the work of Koei Sato and Kate Soper, whose degrowth arguments also illustrate different forms of understanding and forms of abundance, namely through moderating our living standards and curbing our consumption practices. But for me, what's key to moving toward a more just and sustainable direction, or what Nick very appropriately calls an ecological direction, is imbuing in our social systems, or in our social relations, collective life-saving or life-sustaining habits. That is, automating the impulse to care for and sustain one another and the world we inhabit. We were writing the book in the wake of the pandemic, when the discourse of mutual aid and crisis response was really circulating. And I'm not sure when or why I turned to Elaine's scariest thinking in an emergency. I'm sure someone, I don't know. I don't have a memory of those times much, but I'm glad I did, because it really affirmed that the impulse to care does indeed exist, and in fact it is habitual and even compulsory in some cultures. For example, here in Canada, in Saskatchewan, some communities participate in mutual aid contracts, which endow their constituents with the power to declare emergencies, thereby setting into motion various streams of financial and social support systems. In the case of severe flooding, for example, in the village of Vanguard in the year 2000, a number of volunteers from surrounding communities came to Vanguard's assistance, providing food and clearing out contaminated water inside people's homes. The mutual aid contracts in Canada also specify procedures for determining lines of communication, and even include lists of materials for what people have agreed to provide in such crises. Mutual aid is also encoded in Switzerland's political framework. The country passed a law in 1963 during the Cold War requiring all buildings to either include a nuclear bunker or contribute to a public one. Crucially, Swiss policy guarantees equality of survival for every inhabitant, including foreign residents. So in addition to these shelter requirements, Swiss law also assigns specific obligations to its male citizens. Participation by female citizens and foreign residents is voluntary, but similar to Frederick Jameson's call for a universal army, this law requires participants to practice approximately four days a year and assigns refresher courses as needed based on the threat of nuclear war or armed conflict. The maintenance of cultural objects with historical significance is also encoded in the Swiss shelter framework. So Elaine Scary apparently knows some guy who's on the committee for special objects, and it's his job during practice days to go to a particular church in Zurich and collect all the altarpieces and the statues in there. As Scary notes, quote, "In saving any one precious object, what is preserved is not only that object, but that population's link, and through that object to many kindred objects outside of Switzerland," end quote. So we might think of this essential work as protecting the commons, for example. We see the potential for biocommunism in these examples of democratic organizing, and if we can expand this way of thinking and relating to each other, we may be able to reinvent our technological systems. As Chile's project Cybersyn revealed, cybernetic systems can be programmed and designed for the purpose of empowering workers, streamlining communication and industry input and output, redistributing wealth, and expanding public ownership. Although the project rather tragically ended, there are other initiatives exploring the dynamic between human and computer feedback systems for similar socialist ends. Kirill Podovov, a research fellow at Microsoft, is prototyping AI systems and energy microgrids that are, quote, "sensitive to the needs and capabilities of all users, especially those from marginalized communities. This involves creating AI that assists rather than limits human decision-making, a principle crucial in the transition to renewable energy sources," end quote. So Nick and I saw Kirill's presentation at the Historical Materialism Conference a couple of years ago. I thought it was pretty convincing. He's working with residents at a public housing complex in London to figure out how to collectively manage their research, their renewable energy use. As I remember it, I think each household, there's an AI system that determines by, I think, household size, maybe changes in weather, and whether certain households need more energy. Like, for example, if someone uses like medical devices that require more energy, there's an AI that determines how much you have in your reserve for like solar power. But if you use too much or you reach your limit, you are then required, or you have to negotiate with your neighbors to see if they will let you share some of their energy. So it's as much of a social experiment as it is a technical one. Like Project Cybersyn, this kind of cooperation animates our vision of a planning stack in which citizens, scientists, public agencies, government bodies, and technological systems work together to determine the allocation of resources. Importantly, such a planning stack would not be designed for continuous growth, but rather a moderated standard of living. And to this end, we suggest a common basket of goods guaranteeing food, medical care, housing, education, and transportation, alongside the subordination of a market sector and a reduced range of consumer items. So since we're in a church, I thought it would be kind of interesting, like what better place to do a performance to illustrate at least some of our vision of a biocommunism. What I have in mind is a little ecclesiastical, but it's mostly inspired by Yoko Ono's Grapefruit, which was like a conceptual art book of instructions. I was saying to some people I'm a recovering academic, but I'm also a recovering artist, so if you're either an artist or a recovering artist, you're probably familiar with this book. But I thought it would be interesting to combine some of these instructions to animate some of the key tenets of biocommunism, including communal ownership, universal provisioning, or the guarantee of a moderated standard of living, and the essential work of maintaining communities. So here's Yoko Ono's, one of her pieces, or one of her instructions. It's called Painting Until It Becomes Marble. Cut out and hang a painting, a photograph, or a writing that you like. Let visitors cut out their favorite parts and take them. Ask many visitors to cut out their favorite parts until the whole thing is gone. In the case of a writing, ask the visitors to cut out their favorite letter or word. So I took it upon myself to select a work that I liked. It's Hieronymus Bosch's Terrestrial Paradise, which I thought was pretty germane to the idea of protecting the BIOS or maintaining the BIOS, or protecting, in Catherine Hale's words, the fragility of the material world that cannot be replaced. And importantly, I've overlaid selections of our biocommunists, or our our selections of our biocommunist section onto the piece itself.
And I have about 20 different text boxes or text sections, but maybe 10 people can come up and peruse and maybe pick what section speaks most to them. Or if you prefer, I realize this is a really beautiful figurative piece, if you want to take part of a body or part of the fountain, that's also, this is very democratic. This is a democratic experiment. So take what you like. This isn't perfect. We're workshopping collective ownership, right? Everyone ideally would take home a piece, because I was thinking also to add on to Yoko Ono's painting with marble. I think she has another piece where you're supposed to sort of like take apart something and then reassemble it a year or 5 years in the future. So I was thinking everyone, or the volunteers at least, could take a piece home with them, and as a promise to continue the work of mutual responsibility and collective care, we could agree to meet again and reassemble the piece in a very ecclesiastical way once again. So, yes, so people can take some time. You get to own a Hieronymus Bosch, a very postmodern Hieronymus Bosch piece, and parts of Cybernetic circulation complex, and also be part of this very unique site-specific performance.
Biocommunism would be neither a high-tech utopia nor a primitivist dystopia, but a complex society with its own internal paradoxes, torsions, and contradictions.
Big growing, high-intensity consumption in the global north while improving living standards in the global south, more bandwidth for planning global energy flows, less for the planetary selfie tsunami.
The other side of this expectation would be that everyone who is capable would be required to contribute to the work of emergency care and ecological restoration.
The crucial feedback processes would provide an exchange of information about the success, failure, and inadequacies of the planning process.
Biocommunism would mean less of some things and more of others. The circulation process of biocommunism would be geared toward attaining what environmentalists refer to as a circular economy, in which reuse and regeneration of materials becomes central to continuing reproduction.
A planning stack would be a core institution of biocommunism, but the basket of goods it would provide should include guaranteed access to an independent system of free nets, user-managed peer-to-peer networks. These networks would strip away the synthesis of micro-targeted ads and ubiquitous surveillance that drives so much of capital's cybernetic circulation complex.
Maybe I'll read some selections. Biocommunism reworks both the relations and forces of production and circulation, subordinating the pro and anti-tech question to the double imperative of species survival and social equalization. Any solution to biospheric crisis will require both a change in social patterns of production and consumption and new technological infrastructures. A biocommunist system would be capable of both intentional growth and contraction of economic activities. It would not be characterized by the runaway positive feedback loop of profit-propelled growth. I haven't participated in a conceptual art performance in probably 8 years, so that was nice for me.
I was telling Ali that I'm a kind of performer as well, but for karaoke. So it's a different piece. Thank you, and I really appreciate the cyber scene example. And like cyber scene, there are a lot of Latin American examples, especially in the 70s. It was like there was were interrupted because of like coup d'etat and because of U.S. imperialism and so on and so on. Now I'd like to invite Tori Fleming and Fergie Maxwell as discussants for this book talk. Tori Fleming is a PhD candidate at York University in the Communication and Culture program. Her research focused on surveillance, labor, and media communications infrastructures and technologies. She's been a member of the Socialist Project and Leo Panitch School for several years. And Fergie Maxwell is a PhD candidate in communication culture at TMU, Toronto Metropolitan University. Her work enlists a range of ideas from across the critical humanities and social sciences to attend to the affective landscapes and media aesthetics of climate change risk. She has been a member of the Socialist Project's Eco-Socialist Reading Group for several years.
So we just want to say first that we really enjoyed reading your book. Part of why we brought this event together is because we have this eco-socialist reading group, and we like to try to bring some of the authors that we read to come and do a book talk and then have a bit of a discussion that's oriented around the things that we've discussed throughout the weeks that we read your book. So we have about 3 questions between us that we want to ask you about your book that really capture some of the discussions that we've had. And so as you've spoken about, one of the key components or aspects of the cybernetic circulation complex is speed. Not only is CCC used to intensify the speed at which commodities, people, and information flow, but it has produced subsequent changes in communicative, productive, and circulatory infrastructures in order to sustain the speed at which commodities and information is moving. However, when we talk about speed, we almost talk about it as if it has no contradictory aspects that could potentially slow it down, disrupt it, or maybe just circumvent it briefly. And one of the things that we spoke about in the reading group quite consistently was the question of scale as a possible contradiction to speed. And so what we mean by that is the CCC not only facilitates the intensification in which things move, but it also creates the room for more things to move simultaneously. And so we're thinking about a company like Amazon, for example, who combines both of those ideas. They move a tremendous amount of commodities at a very quick speed. But it also creates potential ruptures in the speed from operating smoothly in the way that we think about it. So we wanted to pose to you guys what role you think speed could potentially, or scale could potentially play in slowing down the CCC.
I don't know if I can really answer this question adequately. All I'll say is that, it's clear that anyone who has to log into their Microsoft account knows that there's some sort of rupture, right? The digital revolution was supposed to make everything so much easier and faster, but in fact it's we have layers or strata of sort of digital shit, and it makes it so hard to just seamlessly get online or check in the airport. Everything is actually, I encountered this this sort of paradox of all these things are moving so quickly before my eyes, but at the same time I'm having a really hard time moving through them as a person. And also what you're saying about everyone's ordering, for example, if you're an Amazon person, I know that Nick buys a lot of books on Amazon, so he's a huge offender. You're buying stuff all the time, and yet knowing this sort of the production of these goods, right? And they have to circulate through these various facility centers, right? At what cost, at what human cost are your consumption habits having on people who deliver your packages? I know that I'm looking around in New York City, it's a wasteland of these weird Amazon containers. Someone just said, I can't do this anymore. I can't bring this on whatever truck or whatever sort of thing. I have to get this package container to and from. So I see the sort of the fallacy of speed in the way I in my own consumption habits, and just people really having a hard time getting things done, expecting that everything's going to be so seamless and quick, but not having a good time on the internet today. It's just not the way it was 20, 30 years ago, when people were envisioning this sort of, utopia. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. I think that considering the contradictions of speed is really crucial. Not only because it points towards perhaps some of the shall we say self-hampering problems of the cybernetic circulation complex, but also because it highlights the possibilities for resistance and disruption. I mean, there are I know people in this room who are in the field of labor organizing, who are today thinking very, very seriously about adequate points of resistance are, in fact, to interrupt the flows and movement of companies such as Amazon through labor activism, or to interrupt the operations of various gig worker activities by new forms, strikes or slowdowns. Speed is, in that sense, not just a strength, but a vulnerability of the system, and I think something that perhaps neither of us, neither Alessandra nor I, have adequately highlighted in our presentation of what our book contains, is quite a sustained section on the emergence of new nodes and points of resistance from labor inside the cybernetic circulation complex, who in fact can act as the enemies of the speed of the CCC, and can use the ability to slow, halt, and disrupt as leverage to improve the position of workers, and also not only for issues of shop floor rights and wages, but also unite with other forms of social activism, ecological activism, and so on. And yes, you are right. I do order a lot of books from Amazon, but I'm curbing my habits and diversifying to local books.
Wow. You're a recovering Amazon addict.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, thank you both for the animating talk, and yeah, we loved reading your book in our reading group. And maybe actually I'll start, because I did take a text fragment, so maybe I'll start with the text fragment, because I think I can loop it back into the question I was going to frame. So the text fragment I pulled says, while such a system would draw on cyber-physical technologies, it would also necessarily monitor the ecological and social consequences of these technological apparatuses and self-reflexively adjust its scope accordingly. And to me, this kind of speaks to what you were talking about in regards to habit and the construction of biocommunist praxis as a form of habit. And actually, maybe connecting to what you were just saying about noticing these Amazon containers like around your. I've seen them here. I think I'm probably thinking of the same one. It's like you drag it along the ground. It's almost like a dolly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you just see them littered there, and you're right. It kind of indexes this. It's like, okay, did someone just they had enough for that day, So I want to get at maybe like where does habit kind of break down, both for the CCC and the kind of relations that it animates, and then where can like a biocommunist habit kind of like lever its way into there, kind of emerge from that. And so the example I was thinking was of LLMs, right? So you talk in the book, the LLMs, for instance, They require the extraction of rare earth metals. They require the construction of like large data centers with significant power draw. They require, you know, large labor forces of data cleaners, essentially, that are often outsourced. And each of these kind of moments in the circulation, you know, they mobilize their own cascading kind of contradictions in production, circulation, social reproduction. And so you emphasize in the book that, you know, far-right ideology kind of offers like an escape valve here, right? Like it you know, serves to paper over contradiction and reroutes it through and intensifies the dynamics of the CCC. So what I'm wondering is, where do you see consumer-facing uses of LLMs? I'm thinking specifically in terms of AI companionship, the kind of care work that gets offloaded onto AI. Where do you see that, or can you speak to the relationship that those kind of technologies and those kinds of technical systems have to the circulation of antagonism, right? Where do they fit in here? Is there a sort of ethic of AI use that we can come to in view of biocommunism? What are your thoughts? Yeah.
I think we see patterns of contradiction, but asymmetric contradictions. It's very easy to identify the repressive uses to which new forms of AI are currently being put to use. Just to choose one salient example, the degree which Trump's ICE mobilization is deeply, deeply bound up with the cybernetic circulation complex in terms of the sorts of uses that AI is being put to for surveillance and monitoring with an eye to deportation. The involvement of companies such as Palantir and Clearview and so on are very striking. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are ways in which these technologies are also being used by activists, in fact, opposed to these processes. For example, in the United States, activists have put AIs to use to actually de-anonymize ICE agents. And in other outbreaks of civil unrest around the world in so-called Gen Z revolts, one can actually find large language model AIs being used as vehicles for counter-information against highly repressive governments, which offer, in fact, a certain level of anonymity in the distribution of this. So I think that while it's absolutely correct to realize that at this moment, the deployment of artificial intelligence is predominantly within the hands of capital and the state apparatuses associated with it, I think that it is also important to think of ways in which it may be mobilized in forms of counterpower. And this also goes to the larger point, which I think we attempt to make in the book, that while we are, we hope, strong critics of the cybernetic circulation complex, we also have interest in and hope for a repurposing of these technologies for emancipatory purposes, social equality, and ecological regeneration. We think that this is actually the wager of Marxism that there can be such a thing as an alternative modernity, and that this is in fact what distinguishes an appropriate form of communist resistance to cybernetic circulation complex from pure primitivism or nostalgia for the so-called good old days, which were never in fact that good even to start with. So that is a wager, it's a bet, it's a contentious one, because all the problems that are manifest in the capitalist form of development of LLMs and others are glaringly to the forefront. But I think that there is room and space, in fact, for a cybernetic counterpower, such as has been, as Ali pointed out, periodically struggled for in insurgencies of all kinds against capital.
When you mean, or when you say like AI companions, ethics, the ethical questions around those, do you mean like, you know, would we ever consider these things like self-conscious? Is that what you mean?
No, sorry, I think I wasn't clear enough. What I meant was, what are the ethics of using and becoming reliant on these things? Okay, so not the AI as a subject. Like, how do these systems mediate habit, right? How do they mediate even the capacity to register something as a disaster to begin with, right? Like, what is it? Where does the AI fit into moments like, maybe not necessarily, but moments like the Amazon delivery driver deciding to drop the box on the street and be like, oh, that's it for today, you know?
I think we're seeing this issue very clearly in the medical context, where more and more doctors are relying on the AI's sort of like diagnostic sort of potential, and as a result, they're taking for granted the machine's very, very, very capable ability to find certain patterns, right? And they don't question the diagnosis, or they don't look again at the scans. So, this is a very, it could be a life-threatening condition if you don't have a human oversight. But then again, again in the medical context too, I think there is I'm not really sure what sort of model it is, but it's very good at predicting when a person might contract or develop sepsis in the hospital context. And sepsis is this very, it's really hard to predict, right? So it's a really difficult line to walk, what do you trust, and how do you negotiate these sort of power dynamics now that the machine is becoming so reliable? I don't know, I work in oversight, so I'm partial to human oversight and having, bodies, actual physical bodies, in space, and, we inhabit an embodied world, so looking at the body is still important, especially if that's what you're focusing on and that's what you're treating. But that's really the only way I can really answer your question. But yes, habit is important. You need to construct these frameworks and models for understanding. And as Elaine Scarry says, habit is this very good thing. It can be this very good thing because when you are, in a stressful situation, your impulse is to sort of suspend thought, right? But you need that sort of background, automatic, almost machine sort of processing to sort of take over and, remind you, okay, this is how we're doing this in this scary or high stress environment. It's difficult, it's challenging.
Yeah, just to come in on this, it's a really interesting and thought-provoking question. Maybe turning it around a little from the way you intended it, I would say that one of the critical issues when one is considering AIs and LLMs is, in fact, precisely what habits are these models being trained in. in a certain sense, the whole process of machine learning can be seen as the inculcation of certain habits of perception and assessment into a machine system. In other words, it is not only humans that have habitual forms of perception, but it is in fact AI systems. And the very large question is how far the habits in which contemporary AIs are being trained are exclusively capitalist habits of market-based valuation and prioritization, and how far there are spaces for other forms of machinic habit to be created, and what struggles are necessary, in fact, to create advanced AI systems, which in fact can have altogether different routines and metrics of perception, which are perhaps more closely linked to some of the issues that we try to highlight, such as environmental appreciation or acknowledgement of the importance of social dynamics of equality and care. It seems to me that that although I don't think you intended it in this way, your question really opens up onto that space of the, at the moment, very largely hidden and black box struggle as to what will be the machinic habits that structure the large-scale systems within which it seems that we're going to live.
Thank you.
Okay, we have one more question, and we're pivoting a little. This question is actually about the relationship between like AI and tech corporations and the American state in particular. Representatives of the Trump administration, including the Vice President J.D. Vance, Trump himself, and then also David Sachs, the quote, crypto and AI czar, which I thought was a joke when I first read that, but it turns out that's a real position that's being made for him. They constantly talk about how the fight over AI and America winning the fight over AI is crucial for the retrenchment or the resurgence of the American empire, the maintenance and reproduction of the American empire. And if they don't win this fight, which they argue gives China enough space to significantly contest American power. And I think this is interesting because this moment in AI, I think, diverges quite significantly from the moment when cyberspace or the internet was really developing. In the 1990s or early 2000s, the American state was not identified as a pioneer or like a shepherd in many ways of establishing an American-led internet infrastructure and internet protocols at that time. And in fact, I think was like was purposefully concealed as an agent in terms of creating internet markets that were favorable to the United States and compelling other states to adopt similar forms of like lack of regulation or other things to encourage American corporations from being able to access those areas and establish themselves as being like lead internet corporations. And so I'm wondering then, why do you think the state has reemerged in the way that it has in relation to AI, and how does this relate to the cybernetic circulation complex?
Yeah, so I think you're altogether correct to phrase this in terms of a reemergence of the state, because the state has in fact always been present, and indeed lies at the very inception of the internet the moment of ARPA and its initial exploration as a command and control instrument in the context of Cold War nuclear hostilities with the Soviet bloc. I mean, one can I think that's pretty indisputable. It's also true that this then receded, or the state presence, as you put it, seemed to recede after the moment of Cold War victory, although it by no means ever completely disappeared, and there's a long history of crucial innovation for Silicon Valley, not just in the early moments of the internet, but also the opening of things such as Wi-Fi technology and surveillance systems on which subsequent search engine technologies such as Google would be based. You know, the role of CIA venture capital funding has always been there. But why has it reemerged? Well, you know, I mean, again, I think actually the answer was really framed within the question. It's reemerged because of the appearance of a powerful challenger to American global hegemony. It has emerged because the state, which was seen at the time of the Washington Consensus simply as the cheap labor assembly location for globalized digital capital, in fact, outmaneuvered and surprised American plans by successfully escalating itself into the position of a serious digital competitor. You know, there is what is galvanizing the Trump administration is actually the fear that China constitutes a serious global power competitor, and that it is a system that, however complex the strange hybrid that that socialism with Chinese characteristics presents, has a notably different model from that which is being advanced by the United States, and one which actually in many spheres now seems to be commanding greater popularity and enthusiasm, not least in the digital sphere, where, for example, the open source Chinese AI models are now for the first time outrunning the popularity of the AIs produced by the American complex. So this is a situation of head-on techno-geopolitical clash. And in fact, the Trump endeavor is largely motivated not by a sense of American power, but in fact by a profound anxiety that it is a declining imperial state.
I will just add that I don't think it's a coincidence that the sort of fantasy of immortality made manifest through, you know, supposedly advanced AI architecture and, you know, genetic engineering is gaining ground alongside a growing interest in crypto-fascism and people who are leading the charge in that way. I think if you get to live forever, which I think is a lot of dictators' aims, right, is to sort of arrest a tyranny of the same. So I think these discourses really work together, this sort of, the fantasy of immortality and the AI discourse. I have a really hard time separating them. So that's all I'll add. Anything else?
So we have only 10 minutes to wrap up, and we will collect 2 or 3 questions, quick questions from the audience.
I think that there was one particular feature of our proposal for biocommunism that we had in mind writing those lines. We talk about 2 aspects in which we think that that digital technologies and networks could be repurposed for biocommunist ends. And one of them is as part of a planning stack, which would be, in a sense, a form of governance based on, we would hope, decentralized, distributed, participatory consultation, but would, because it is ultimately a direction of policies and resource allocation, in a sense, have to be highly disciplined process with subject to normative standards of verification. What constitutes evidence for claims, so forth, and so on. And the other, and we, in a certain sense, pose alongside that, but perhaps in a certain tension with that, the idea of a more sort of libertarian network of what we term free nets to enable autonomous collectives of various sorts and interest groups to, in a commercial free environment without advertising and micro-targeting, formulate their own networks of sociality. And that would be a much more sort of free-for-all, rambunctious sort of setup. And so one can imagine that there would be a certain amount of tension, probably, between the planning stack and the free nets. The free nets would be full of criticism of what the planning stack is doing. It would be the sort of domain where ideas have not been widely ratified within the planning stack might be explored. So there would be, in a sense, a certain amount of friction there. Personally, I would say that sort of friction between a necessarily highly organized governance structure and a more libertarian domain of digital discourse should, in fact, be seen as a feature and not a bug in terms of some new system. That is precisely the sort of tension which would introduce the sort of dynamism and checks and balances within which previous highly top-down experiments in socialism have had a real deficit, right? Okay, so so we want the planners and we want the troublemakers. Yeah, we want probably an eco-socialist majority, but goddammit, we even probably have to hear from the libertarian right and the people that we regarded as off the board in terms of those sort of planning discussions. And that is a tension that would have to be worked through within an actual dynamic system, which is not simply repressive in its operation.
I'll just add to that. I follow a few degrowth initiatives on LinkedIn of all places. And there are certain modules for, conflict resolution. So there's already an understanding that even if you're motivated by the same sort of cause, there will be disagreements and differences. Everyone has different needs and different expectations. So again, it's part of, it's a feature, not a bug, of the sort of discourse or meaning making and social relations that we think are important. And maybe I can segue into yours. I don't think we need to stop science as such. I think we need to stop the emphasis on the sort of Western neoliberal colonial science that really takes up so much space and make room for, indigenous science practices and knowledge. So a different way of doing science, I think, would help us move in a different direction or a better direction. But I don't know how to do that. I think we need, a shift in discourse. So, and that's really hard to do. That takes a lot of time, and hopefully, if people are committed to the cause, as so many people are, it's a sort of snowball effect, and you can only hope that interest in the cause grows.
In response to your question, yes and no. I mean, obviously, the whole tenor of critique of the CCC and the biocommunist proposal is that much greater focus must be given to the issues of social inequality. Does that mean calling a halt to science? Well, I agree with Ali in a sense. I think it's not a question of halting science in order to deal with issues of inequality. I think that in fact is a dual struggle to in fact advance and alter the direction of technological innovation to assist in the struggle against inequality. There are aspects of contemporary science and technology which are absolutely vital to some of the causes that are wrapped into our concept of biocommunism. There, in fact, would not be a perception, for example, of global warming and climate crisis without contemporary advanced and digital technologies. We only comprehend global warming through the operations of meteorological systems, which are in fact a vast digital machine. The predictions on which proposals for transition to net zero energy are based are in fact large-scale climate simulations which depend on highly sophisticated, often near or actual AI models. We need these technologies, not just in terms of dealing with climate change, but with other issues of epidemiology and other large-scale problems. I see it not as a question of a halt, but as a swerve, right? There's a difference between applying the emergency brake and making a smart cornering maneuver. And I'm in favor of the smart cornering maneuver, which involves at once slowing down some things and accelerating others.
Thank you, Nick, Ali, Tori, Fergie, for more.